Okay, so we're looking at Dickinson's poem "Was Not Death for I Stood Up," and thinking about this question: to what extent is this poem, this text, nihilistic? Now, thinking about the concept of existential nihilism is the belief that life doesn't have any intrinsic meaning or value, and so with respect to the universe, existential nihilism posits, it suggests or argues that a single human or even the entire human species is insignificant, without purpose, and unlikely to change in the totality of existence. And the meaninglessness of life is mainly explored in the philosophical school of existentialism. So, trying to think about whether or not we can say that this poem is nihilistic. Is it capturing human experience as being in some way meaningless? So we look at the very first couplet. It was not death, for I stood up. So this opening here is an attempt to define the experience that we might have of a growing awareness of the emptiness of life. So we've got a poem that is trying to narrate this. It's trying to narrate this developing awareness that life is in some way empty. And it's compared initially to the void of mortality, to the emptiness of death. But importantly, it's not death. And so what we see in this is that there is an equivalent experience that's nearly the same as death, but it isn't actually death. And so that comparison is negated, it's rejected. So it's not death. But the only reason that she knows, the speaker, that it's not death that she's experiencing is because she's standing up. So the only dissimilarity between her experience at this point and of someone dying is the fact that she stood up. So she is almost like a zombie, standing up sort of as a human being, proving that she's alive, but with all the other features of a dead person. It was not death, for I stood up, and all the dead lie down. So her state is bleak because we see the only thing that is different about her situation is that she's standing and that dead people tend to be lying down. So we've got an attempt to define this experience through what we would call figurative negations, comparisons, like metaphors and similes and personification. Those language features are all built on comparisons, but actually these ones are suggested and then rejected. And so we've got, again, a poem that is attempting to capture this experience of a growing sense of life being in some way empty, but not quite ever settling on any one sort of analogy between what that feels like and a comparison. And that is a bit like A Narrow Fellow in the sense that we never actually encounter the snake. We encounter the snake through the sort of effects that it has on the surroundings. So we encounter this experience of seeing life as gradually becoming meaningless, not through any definite comparison, but through all of the comparisons that are similar but not quite accurate enough and that are rejected by the speaker. So the next couplet then compares this experience to nighttime. So it's not death, and it's now not night. For all the bells put out their tongues for noon. So she knows it's not night because the bells of the usually of a church spire that ring 3 times at 3 p.m, 4 times at 4 p.m. They're ringing 12 times to show us that it's noon. So she knows it's not necessarily nighttime because she's hearing the church bells ring 12 times so that we know that it's midday. But we've got this antithesis of night and noon. It's kind of paradoxical because actually you could hear the bells ring 12 times and it could be midnight. So there's something contradictory about this. It doesn't quite make sense. These ideas are oppositional. night and noon. They're antithetical. But it does capture the sense of despair at the realization of emptiness. If the experience of being alive makes noon, the afternoon, in some way feel like night. So she only knows that it's not the afternoon because she's hearing the bells ring. But everything else feels like nighttime. It feels bleak. It feels dark and empty. But we've also got potentially this example of synesthesia, of the bells ringing being compared to an animal almost sticking its tongue out like a snake to taste something. So we've got a suggestion perhaps of the bells being personified to try and taste time, as if it's trying in some way to detect the time itself with its tongue and failing to do so. So again, you've got that blurring of the senses that creates this overall sense of disorientation. Or you might interpret these lines almost as a kind of childish act of indifference, of not caring, as if the bells are poking their tongue out, and kind of going nah, 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 at the speaker and making fun of them, almost mocking them. As if time in some way doesn't care about us, is utterly indifferent to our sense of despair and our sense of loneliness and meaninglessness. So it's almost as if time, embodied by these bells, is mocking the speaker. It's then compared to frost. So it's not death, it's not night, and it's not quite frost. So the feeling in some way appears to be like coldness. It appears to be like darkness. It appears to be like death. But actually her senses tell her otherwise. So it's not frost. For on my flesh I felt siroccos crawl. So it's not frost because she can feel on her skin hot winds. That's what a sirocco is, a really warm wind crawling. So we've got this again, this sense of sensory disorientation. It's not frost, even though it seems to be as perhaps cold in terms of perhaps an emotional coldness. Because on her flesh she can feel hot winds. So we've got maybe a sense of what's called dualism here, the opposition between mind and body. So she only knows it's not frost, the emotional coldness of meaninglessness, because her body is telling her that actually the surroundings are warm. So we've got then a sense of perhaps disjointed experience between the mind and the body, as if the mind is somehow separate from and dislocated from the emotional and spiritual self, which is inside. There's a sense of that, I think, in a certain slant of light, as if the senses have that total power over the spiritual self. Here, they seem to be disconnected. Feeling siroccos crawl, we've got this hot, barren wind that then is personified and emphasized with those two dashes, so that the crawling is what we focus our attention on in that couplet. As if the hot winds are like a spider creeping up someone's arm, which gives them a sense of sinister threat, but also of nightmarish hallucination and derangement of the speaker. She feels like it's cold, but actually it can't be because she's hot, and the heat feels like almost a crawling animal up her skin. This, if anyone has ever had a really bad fever where you kind of lose your rationality a little bit, this seems to be a kind of paranoid, fevered state that the speaker is in here, as if they're not really fully understanding the surroundings. But it isn't fire. So now she reverses this temperature imagery. So it was not frost now, but it's also not fire. For just my marble feet could keep a chancel cool. So there's a couple of bits of information here. She describes herself through the metaphor of what is called a gisant, Gisant, which is a giant tomb statue, which might occupy the space in what's called a chancel, which is the space around an altar in the church. So it's the images of marble feet. So the speaker describes herself through this metaphor as if she is in some way like a tomb statue. And it's just that her marble feet that are actually keeping this sacred space cold. So even though in the previous couplet her skin feels hot as if there are these barren winds crawling on it, now her feet are so cold that they seem to be cooling down this big marble space that's almost being imagined in a church. So this is the space around an altar, a chancel. And all of this metaphorical description contradicts the sensory information of the previous two lines, where in the previous two lines we felt frosty but then hot. Now it's not fire because it's cold. So we've got a kind of reversal of those images of temperature constructed through this metaphor that compares the speaker to a tomb-like statue. So it's, again, something that symbolizes death and lifelessness. And so there's a shift here. And yet it tasted like them all. This experience felt like all of these things I've just said that it wasn't. So it felt like them all, but actually wasn't all of those things. But in terms of the senses, there's a shift here. From the nerves and temperature to taste. It tasted like them all, as if she's sort of savouring this comparison between a sense of growing meaninglessness and all these other feelings of night and mortality and heat and coldness. It's like all of these things. It tastes like them, but actually isn't quite those things. With this, there's a suggestion perhaps of bodily decomposition and sensory disorientation, as if the person's mind is falling apart. We're tasting these comparisons. There's something hallucinatory about this image. The figures I have seen are those metaphors and figurative tropes she's used so far and rejected and negated. You know, the comparison to death, the comparison to night, the comparison to coldness and frost, the comparison to heat. Those are the figures. Those are the basis of figurative tropes, figurative images that she's created that compare this experience with other things like death, heat, coldness, and darkness. But now she's seen them. She's tasted. They tasted like these things, these figures that she has seen. So these comparisons that she's seen, but that have ultimately been rejected. They're set orderly for burial. So they're organised in an orderly fashion. But their order is inadequate in capturing the emptiness and spiritual chaos at the centre of the poem, because they're organised for a burial. So these figures of emptiness are actually being buried by the poet because they're not adequate, they're not accurate enough. But their inadequacy is what reminds her of her own inadequacy. They're set orderly for burial. They're set in an organised way in this poem, couplet by couplet, for me to reject them, for me to kill them off, because they're not accurate. They're inadequate representations of what she feels. But ironically, that inadequacy is in the end what reminds the speaker of her own emptiness and uselessness. And so it's actually their inadequacy that makes them ironically adequate. So because they aren't quite good enough at capturing the experience, that inadequacy is what actually makes them useful to her, because they remind the speaker of her own emptiness and uselessness, and that is what in the end gives them poetic value. They reminded me of my burial as if my life were shaven and fitted to a frame. So we see this comparison through this simile, as if my life were shaven like a piece of wood and fitted into a frame, constructed into the wooden frame of a coffin, as if my life were a claustrophobic frame of a coffin. So that comparison, I think, is speaking to the hostility that we see Dickinson express towards predestination, as if your life is shaven and shaped for you before you've even lived it and fitted into a claustrophobic space. You're trapped in the vision of your soul that you've been prescribed by the church. And I could not breathe without a key, and it was like midnight sun. So we've got this theme of constriction, as if the speaker is in some way trapped inside a coffin. So there's this idea of claustrophobia that's developing, which perhaps causes the numbness that's being described earlier, but is ironically registered through the senses. So Dickinson seems to be saying through this poem, I feel constricted, I feel claustrophobic, my life feels as if I'm being buried in a coffin, and that's making me feel numb and empty and purposeless. But the way I'm capturing that sense of numbness is through this bizarre, disorienting sensory imagery. So there's a sense of needing a key in some way to break open this coffin that functions as a metaphor for her restricted, predefined life. But this is a turn in the poem. It was like midnight sun, where the speaker directly confronts the void, the emptiness of life. And the only similarity that she is comfortable with drawing, it was like midnight a bit. So the only similarity, it was like this. She doesn't say that in any of the other couplets. It was not this because, it was not this because. Here is where she says what it was like, midnight, the absence of light and the end of something. A bit, some, with the comma afterwards. So this is a kind of classic sense of her, this is classic Dickinsonian conditionality. A classic sense of her being cautious, of saying it's a bit like this rather than it's completely like this. So this is the only comparison that she settles upon. It was like midnight sun, when everything that has ticked has stopped. So all of transient life and time itself stops. Everything that ticked has stopped. There's a shift into the past tense in this phrase, in this line, that signifies the shift into emptiness. When everything that lives has stopped living, and space stares all around. So emptiness, space, is personified as doing the staring, because it's the only thing that's left. And the phrase all around suggests that it's widespread. So time has stopped and everything has gone, and the only thing that is doing anything is emptiness, space, staring. And then this final couplet, or grisly frosts, first autumn morns, repeal the beating ground. So these grisly frosts are equated to this space, this emptiness, staring. So frosts in this imagery are deathly, repealing the vitality of life, pulsing in the beating ground. Repealing means to take away or pull back the life that we see in the beating ground, as if the ground is like a heart that is pulsing with life. The image here is of ice taking away life on a first autumn morning, as the ice just begins to spread across the landscape. Not of it pausing or freezing life, but of it repealing it, of it taking away something that has previously been given. And there's something ironic about this, because the frosts are personified. And it's the personification that gives them their deathly quality. So they're ironically given the deathly quality that they have, where they can repeal the beating ground, they can take away life through the figurative device of personification, which is about giving life to something that doesn't have it. Frosts aren't animate things, but they are taking away the life from the ground. But there's also, I think, the suggestion of sort of frustrated fists in this beating ground, as if it is unhappily being dragged to its end. The last 4 lines bring us to this closest equivalent for spiritual desolation, but most like chaos. This experience is most like mad, disorganized emptiness. The Greek notion of chaos, the world, the emptiness before the world exists, before the gods are created. That's what she feels like, of nothingness. It's most like chaos, stopless and cool. So this emptiness is ongoing. It doesn't have points where it stops because it's timeless and it's immortal, which is unlike the ticking of transient life which we see in the previous couplet, when everything that has ticked has stopped. It's also cool, this chaos. It doesn't have feeling. It's indifferent. It's unconcerned. It's most like chaos, this experience that she's going through, because it's permanent and it's without feeling. And it doesn't have a chance or spar. Now, a spar is the mast of a ship. So there is a nautical image being constructed here of someone looking out into a desolate, empty sea and expecting to see a ship rescuing them, as if they are in some way spiritually shipwrecked. But in this state of chaos, of emptiness, there's no chance of salvation. There's no spar, there's no ship that can be seen on the horizon, or even a report of land to justify despair. So this nautical image is developed to the point where the speaker is shipwrecked and lost. There's no report of land. There's nothing to base a hope for salvation upon, which is similar to the imagery in both of these poems. Behind Me Dips Eternity and I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, where spirituality is constructed through nautical imagery, like the crescent on the sea and Behind Me Dips Eternity. But there's not even a report of land to justify the feeling of despair. There's a sense that the speaker is so lost that even her despair is difficult to justify and explain, as nothing has really been lost. There was never a hope in the first place. This is really bleak. There's not even the suggestion of being saved, that if you lost, you would feel a sense of despair. There was never any chance of being saved, first of all. There was never any reason to justify a feeling of despair, because you were never able to be saved in the first place. It's not that you've done something and lost it, it's that there was never a possibility in the original situation. So this is, again, a really direct attack on the Calvinist sin of despair, of losing faith. It's being revealed in this poem as ludicrous, as all meaning is empty. There isn't anything that ever existed in the first place that you could lose and then say was the basis for your feeling of despair. It's nothingness that the speaker is ultimately trying to capture.